There's an old military axiom that every cadet learns before they learn how to salute. It goes like this: the most dangerous enemy is not the one who hates you, it is the one who has never bothered to understand you. The Vashtar Dominion never bothered, and that failure of imagination cost them a colony of their own, a war fleet, and a doctrine of galactic supremacy that had stood unchallenged for 400 years. This is the story of Kesler's Landing, a human colony of 11,000 people that the Vashtar Dominion burned to the ground as a political message. It was supposed to prove a point. Instead, it became the last mistake a generation of Vashtar commanders ever made. The message was supposed to take 6 weeks to matter. It took 6 minutes. Let's go back to the beginning. Kesler's Landing sat on the edge of what star charts called the Bramwell Expanse, a scattering of yellow dwarf systems that nobody in the galaxy had cared about until humanity showed up and started building. It was not a military installation. It had no strategic value that any sane species would bother contesting. It had wheat fields that stretched to a false horizon, a fishing operation on an inland sea the colonists had nicknamed the Kettle, and a schoolhouse with exactly 142 children enrolled, because the colony's administrator kept the number in her head like a rosary. Her name was Administrator Selin Okafor, and she had spent 9 years building something quiet and unremarkable out of raw dirt and stubbornness. That was the whole story of Kesler's Landing. Unremarkable. A footnote. The kind of place that history skips over on its way to somewhere more interesting. The Vashtar Dominion did not attack it because it was valuable. They attacked it because it was convenient. 3 months earlier, a human survey vessel had refused to yield right-of-way in a contested transit corridor near the Dominion's outer holdings. No shots were fired. No treaty was broken. It was, by any sober reading of interstellar law, a jurisdictional shrug, the kind of thing that gets resolved by a strongly worded diplomatic cable and a bottle of something expensive shared between ambassadors. But the Vashtar High Command did not see a jurisdictional shrug. They saw a species failing to kneel. The Dominion had built its entire galactic identity on the idea that other species knelt. 400 years of expansion had taught them that resistance was something you encountered exactly once. Briefly, before a civilization recalibrated its posture and fell into the correct alignment beneath Vashtar authority. Humanity was young. Humanity was scattered. Humanity had barely finished arguing with itself before it went to the stars. To the Vashtar War Council, humans were an adolescent species that had wandered into a room full of adults and forgotten to lower its voice. So they decided to teach a lesson. Grand Marshal Tavan Kasari made the decision personally, and he made it the way a man swats an insect off his sleeve, without ceremony, without malice, and without the faintest suspicion that the insect might have a memory. He selected Kesler's Landing from a list of 17 candidate targets because it was undefended, because it was far from Earth's core fleets, and because burning a farming colony would generate exactly the kind of grainy, horrifying footage that plays well on 100 different species' news feeds. It was not about Kesler's Landing. It was never about Kesler's Landing. It was about every human leader who would watch the footage afterward and understand, with perfect clarity, what happened to species that forgot to kneel. Grand Marshal Kasari called it Operation Correction. He gave the order on a Tuesday, ship time. He did not attend the strike personally. Men like Kasari rarely do. The Vashtar task force that arrived above Kesler's Landing numbered 9 capital ships, an overwhelming and, from the Dominion's perspective, almost embarrassingly generous amount of force for a target with no defense fleet whatsoever. That was deliberate too. The message needed to be unambiguous. This was not a battle. This was an execution, staged for an audience that was not even present. The bombardment lasted 11 hours. There is no way to describe what happened to Kesler's Landing that does not sound to a human ear unbearable. And it should sound unbearable because it was. The orbital strikes came in waves, methodical and almost bureaucratic, in their thoroughness, cutting through the wheat fields in the schoolhouse and the fishing docks on the Kettle, with the same flat indifference. Administrator Okafor spent the last confirmed transmission of her life, not pleading for mercy, because she understood there would be none, but reciting the names of the children in her care into an open channel so that somewhere, someone would have to hear them. Nobody on the Dominion side listened to the recording all the way through. It was filed as evidence of successful message delivery. 11,000 people. Gone by the time the 9th hour turned to the 10th. The footage reached Earth 4 days later, carried by a courier drone that had been racing the news the entire way. And it detonated across human civilization with a force that no physical weapon could have matched. There was grief, an ocean of it, raw and immediate and entirely without the comfort of surprise, because everyone had always known, somewhere in the back of their mind, that the galaxy was not gentle. But underneath the grief, and growing faster than anyone in the Vashtar Dominion could have anticipated, there was something else, something colder, something that did not weep. It was fury with a schedule. President Elena Mateo received the full briefing in a windowless room, 40 meters beneath what used to be called the Pentagon, back when humanity still organized its wars by continent instead of by star system. She watched the recovered footage twice. She did not speak during either viewing. When it ended the second time, she asked a single question, and it was not the question anyone in the room expected. She asked where the nearest fleet was. This is the part of the story the Vashtar Dominion did not know, could not have known, and would spend the rest of their history wishing they had bothered to learn sooner. Humanity had not spent the previous 80 years since first contact simply building farms and schoolhouses and hoping the universe would be kind. It had spent those 80 years doing what humanity has always done best, in the shadow of a threat it could not fully see. It prepared. There is a difference between a species that has never known war and a species that has forgotten nothing about it. Humanity was the second kind. Every human colony effort, every trade agreement, every diplomatic smile offered to species like the Vashtar, who mistook courtesy for submission, had been built on top of a foundation that the wider galaxy never saw because it was never meant to be seen. It was called the Halloway doctrine, named after the admiral who first proposed it, in the tense, uncertain years right after first contact, when it became brutally clear to Earth's leadership that most of the galaxy operated on a simple principle: power, respected power, and nothing else. Admiral Rena Halloway had stood in front of a very different, much more frightened cabinet decades earlier and said something that would end up engraved, eventually, on a memorial wall that did not exist yet. She had said that humanity did not need to be the strongest power in the galaxy. It only needed every other power to never be certain that it wasn't. Out of that doctrine came the reserve fleets. They were not secret in the sense of being hidden underground somewhere, waiting like a myth. They were secret in a much more effective way. They were hidden in plain sight, disguised as unremarkable Border Patrol squadrons, listed in public registries under names so boring that no foreign intelligence service had ever thought them worth a second look. The 12th Border Flotilla, the Kestrel Line. Names that sounded like paperwork. Because that was exactly the point. Behind those unremarkable names sat some of the most advanced warships humanity had ever built, crewed by officers who trained constantly against threat profiles compiled from a century of careful, patient intelligence gathering on every species humanity had ever brushed against, including, especially, the Vashtar Dominion. Dr. Amara Chen had spent 11 years of her life on the technical side of that patience. She was the kind of person history tends to remember badly if it remembers her at all, because architects rarely get statues, only the soldiers who use what they build. She led the reverse engineering division that had spent over a decade studying every fragment of Vashtar technology that had ever fallen into human hands, from a disabled scout drone recovered near a mining outpost to the wreckage of a damaged Corvette that had made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating a human border patrol 2 years prior. The Vashtar had a doctrine of their own, and it was a good one by the standards of every species that had rolled over for them in the past 4 centuries. Overwhelming force, applied early, applied visibly, so that resistance never had time to organize. It worked because it had never been tested against a species that specialized in exactly the wrong environment for that doctrine to succeed. Humanity did not fight best when it was strong. Humanity fought best when it was cornered, when the odds were stacked, when there was nothing left to do but get creative or get dead. Dr. Chen's team had reverse-engineered the shielding technology from that captured corvette and found something the Vashtar themselves may not have fully appreciated. Their shields were exceptional against sustained, predictable bombardment. They were far less exceptional against short, layered, precisely timed strikes designed to hit the same resonance frequency 3 times in under a second. It was the kind of vulnerability that only becomes visible to someone who has nothing better to do than stare at the same data for 11 years, refusing to let it go. She called the resulting weapons system Project Bastard, and when a nervous liaison from the Defense Council asked her, with visible discomfort, whether that name might need to be revised before it appeared in an official briefing, she reportedly told him that the name was accurate and the discomfort was his problem to manage. It stayed Project Bastard. Alongside the technology sat the fleet itself, and this is where the story of the reserve fleet stops being about clever engineering and starts being about something closer to prophecy. Admiral Harrison Voss had commanded the Kestrel line for 6 years by the time Kessler's Landing burned, and in that time he had run his crews through more drills, more simulated first-contact hostilities, more grinding, unglamorous readiness exercises than any fleet in recorded human history had ever undergone during a period of official peace. His officers used to joke quietly that Voss trained them like the war had already started and nobody had bothered to tell them the details. He never laughed at that joke. He also never told them they were wrong. Admiral Voss had a saying, one that made its way into unofficial fleet culture, the way good soldierly wisdom always does, passed mouth to mouth faster than any official doctrine could travel. He used to say that a fleet that trains for peace gets a parade. A fleet that trains for war gets to come home. He had built the Kestrel line to come home every single time, and in 6 years it had. He was 340 light-years from Kessler's Landing when the strike began. That distance, in a galaxy where faster-than-light travel is measured in days and hours rather than years, was not a comfortable cushion. It was closer than any Vashtar planner ever imagined a serious human military asset would be allowed to sit quietly at the edge of a region the Dominion considered thoroughly pacified and beneath notice. They had run the calculations on human military dispersal exactly once, years earlier, filed the results, and never updated them. That is the quiet, unglamorous, devastating failure at the heart of this entire story. Not a betrayal, not an ambush, just old intelligence, treated as permanent truth by a species too certain of its own superiority to imagine it needed updating. Admiral Voss received the Kessler's Landing distress signal 11 minutes after the bombardment began, relayed through 3 separate emergency beacons that had somehow miraculously survived long enough to scream into the dark before they were silenced, along with everything else. He did not wait for orders from Earth. The Halloway doctrine had anticipated this exact moment decades earlier and had written its answer directly into Fleet Command Authority. Any reserve fleet commander who received confirmed evidence of a deliberate, unprovoked attack on a human colony was authorized, immediately without further clearance, to engage at his own discretion. It was the single most controversial clause in the entire doctrine when it was first drafted, because it handed enormous, terrifying power to individual admirals. Halloway had defended it with a line that Voss kept pinned above his own command console for 6 straight years. She had written that the 6 hours it takes a committee to authorize justice are 6 hours a dying colony does not have. Voss gave the order to his fleet 11 minutes and 40 seconds after the distress signal reached him. He did not deliver a speech. He did not need one. What he said instead, recorded and later released, as part of the official mission archive, became one of the most quoted lines in the aftermath of the entire conflict. He said, "Plot an intercept course for the Vashtar task force above Kessler's Landing, and tell the fleet that today they get to stop training." The Kestrel line went to full battle readiness in under 4 minutes. Meanwhile, back at Kessler's Landing, the Vashtar task force was doing exactly what 9 centuries of unbroken doctrinal success had taught them to do after a demonstration strike. They were finishing up. Fleet Commander Draith Solon, who had personally overseen the bombardment from the bridge of his flagship, the Voice of Correction, had already begun drafting his after-action report, a document that would eventually become one of the more painfully studied texts in Vashtar military history, though not for the reasons Solon intended when he wrote it. Solon's report described the operation as a complete and unqualified success, colony infrastructure eliminated, casualties total, message delivered with maximum visibility and minimum ambiguity. He recommended the footage be distributed to 17 additional species, currently in what Dominion internal documents euphemistically called ongoing alignment discussions, meaning species who had not yet fully submitted to Vashtar authority. He was drinking something ceremonial, a thick amber liquid reserved for the Dominion's officer class on the occasion of a successful message operation, when his tactical officer interrupted him with a sensor reading that did not match any threat profile in the Dominion's databases. The tactical officer's name, for whatever small mercy history offers him, was Vashtar, and he would go on to be one of the only Vashtar officers from that engagement whose voice survives in the historical record because he made the mistake of leaving his console channel open during the moments that followed. Vashtar reported an unidentified contact cluster emerging from faster-than-light transit at a bearing that put it 30 seconds from weapons range. Commander Solon, according to the same surviving recording, did not even turn around. He asked, with the bored irritation of a man interrupted during a toast, whether it was a civilian evacuation ship attempting something foolish. Vashtar said no. He said it was warships. 22 of them. And they were already firing. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the space between a threat you did not see coming and the moment it lands. And it is the same silence in every culture in the galaxy, human or otherwise, because it is not a cultural artifact. It is a biological one. It is the silence of a mind that has just realized too late that its model of the world was wrong. The Kestrel line dropped out of faster-than-light directly into optimal firing position, a maneuver that should have been physically impossible according to every piece of Vashtar tactical doctrine, because faster-than-light transition was universally understood to require a minimum stabilization window before weapon systems could engage. Dr. Chen's team had spent 4 years solving exactly that problem, developing a transition protocol that allowed weapons to come online during the final microseconds of the drop itself rather than after it. It was untested in live combat. It had never needed to be tested in live combat until it did. It worked. Admiral Voss's flagship, appropriately and somewhat grimly named, the Meridian's Answer, led the strike personally, and the first target Voss selected was not the voice of correction. It was the escort screen surrounding it, the 4 cruisers whose only job was to absorb exactly this kind of surprise attack and buy their flagship time to reposition. They did not get the chance. Project Bastard had been designed around a single, elegant, brutal insight that Vashtar shielding was strong against everything except precision. 22 human warships opened fire in a coordinated pattern that had been drilled so many times in simulation that the crews executing it did not need to think, only to act, hitting each targeted cruiser's shield resonance 3 times within the same second, at the exact frequency Dr. Chen's team had identified over a decade of patient, unglamorous, thankless research. Vashtar shields are not designed to fail gracefully. They are designed to hold absolutely, until the moment they cannot, and then they fail completely, catastrophically, all at once. All 4 escort cruisers lost shielding within the same 11-second window. Commander Solon, watching from the bridge of the voice of correction, reportedly said nothing for the first 4 of those seconds. Vashtar's open channel recorded the sound of him rising from his chair. It recorded, faintly, the sound of the ceremonial drink falling and shattering on the deck. By the time Solon found his voice again, 2 of his escort cruisers were gone entirely, and the other 2 were venting atmosphere into the vacuum in long, glittering streams that, from a distance, almost looked beautiful, in the terrible way that catastrophe sometimes does when viewed from far enough away to lose its meaning. This was the moment, precisely documented later by both human and eventually Vashtar historians, that came to be known across both civilizations by different names for the same idea. Humans called it the 6-minute reply. The Vashtar, in the surviving internal records they were eventually forced to release as part of the post-war tribunal proceedings, called it something closer to the awakening, though not in any tone of celebration. It was the moment Commander Solon understood, with the particular horror reserved for men who have built their entire identity around certainty, that everything Vashtar military doctrine had taught him about humanity was catastrophically wrong. He gave the order to break formation and retreat. It did not matter. Admiral Voss had already anticipated the order before Solon gave it, because 6 years of training a fleet for exactly this scenario teaches a commander to think several moves ahead of an enemy who is still catching up to the present moment. The Kestrel line had entered the engagement not in a simple frontal formation, but in a wide encirclement pattern, one that had been quietly closing around the Vashtar task force from the instant of transition, using the confusion of the opening strike as cover for the maneuver. By the time Solon ordered his retreat, there was nowhere left to retreat to. The voice of correction attempted a faster-than-light jump anyway, a desperate maneuver that Vashtar engineering manuals explicitly warned against attempting under active fire, because the stabilization field required for a clean transition is fragile, and a fragile field under sustained bombardment does not simply fail to activate. It fails violently, tearing outward instead of inward, consuming whatever ship attempted it. The voice of correction did not survive its own escape attempt. Commander Drath Solon, the man who had personally overseen the destruction of 11,000 human lives at Kessler's Landing and drafted an after-action report calling it an unqualified success, died in the same kind of instant, unrecorded silence that he had inflicted on Administrator Okafor and her 142 children. There is no poetry in that fact. There is only accounting. Of the 9 Vashtar capital ships that had arrived above Kessler's Landing 11 hours earlier, 6 minutes of engagement with the Kestrel line left 3 destroyed outright, 4 crippled beyond any hope of independent faster-than-light retreat, and 2 attempting surrender, a concept that Vashtar military doctrine barely acknowledged existed, because in 400 years of expansion they had rarely been on the receiving end of a situation that required it. Admiral Voss accepted the surrender of those 2 ships personally, over an open channel, and his response to the Vashtar officer who offered it became, alongside Halloway's original doctrine and Chen's stubborn insistence on the name bastard, one of the defining quotes of the entire conflict. The surrendering officer, shaken and clearly unprepared for the collapse of every assumption his career had been built on, asked Voss what terms of surrender humanity intended to impose. Voss told him that humanity did not negotiate terms with the people who burned its children. He told him that the only thing being offered was the chance to survive long enough to explain in detail to a Dominion War tribunal exactly whose order this had been. That single sentence, more than any battle report or casualty figure, was the moment the galaxy's understanding of humanity changed permanently. Because here is the part of this story that the wider galaxy found almost impossible to process in the days and weeks that followed. Humanity had not simply won an engagement. It had demonstrated, in the space of 6 catastrophic minutes, that an entire foundational assumption of Vashtar military doctrine, an assumption that other species had also quietly absorbed simply by watching 400 years of unbroken Dominion success, was false. The assumption was this: that overwhelming force, applied early and applied visibly, ends resistance before it can organize. Humanity had organized 80 years before anyone thought to look. News of the engagement reached the Vashtar homeworld 11 days later, and it did not arrive quietly. It arrived attached to a full data packet, deliberately transmitted by Admiral Voss under direct authorization from President Mateo, containing sensor logs, Kel Vashorn's surviving open-channel recording, and a formal, unambiguous statement of intent from the human government. The statement was short. It did not read like a threat because it did not need to. It read like a fact. It said that humanity had absorbed the destruction of Kessler's Landing as it had absorbed every hardship in its long, difficult history, not by breaking, but by remembering. It said that the Kestrel line was one of 6 reserve fleets currently active along humanity's borders, and that the Vashtar Dominion had just witnessed in full the doctrine underlying every single one of them. It said that humanity did not seek war with the Dominion, but that any future demonstration aimed at Earth's leadership would be answered in the same currency, on the same timeline, without exception, and without further warning. It closed with a single line that President Matteo insisted on adding personally over the objections of several advisors who thought it too blunt for formal diplomatic correspondence. The line read, "You sent a message. We understood it perfectly. This is ours." The reaction inside the Vashtar Dominion's ruling council was, according to records later obtained during post-war tribunal proceedings, something close to institutional panic. Grand Marshal Tovin Kesari, the man who had ordered Operation Correction with the casual indifference of someone swatting an insect, found himself, within weeks, stripped of command and placed under formal investigation, not out of any late-arriving moral awakening among the Dominion's leadership, but out of pure, cold political calculation. A species that could annihilate a 9-ship task force in 6 minutes, using a border patrol squadron nobody had ever bothered to properly assess, was not a species the Dominion could afford to have angry at a specific named individual who might, plausibly, be handed over. Kesler was extradited to a joint tribunal 8 months later, alongside 11 other officers involved in authorizing or executing Operation Correction. The tribunal itself became one of the strange, quiet landmarks of the post-war period, less dramatic than the battle that preceded it, but in some ways more important, because it established something the galaxy had never truly seen from humanity before. Restraint applied from a position of total, undeniable strength. Humanity did not demand the Dominion's surrender. It did not seize territory. It did not impose the kind of crushing reparations that a lesser, more vindictive victor might have reached for in the aftermath of 11,000 murdered colonists. What it demanded was accountability, specific, individual, and total. Every officer with command authority over Operation Correction faced formal prosecution. Kesler himself received a life sentence within a secure human facility, a decision that surprised several other galactic powers who had expected humanity to demand execution. President Matteo's public statement on the sentencing became, in its own quiet way, as widely quoted as anything Admiral Voss said during the battle itself. She said that humanity did not need to become monsters in order to hold monsters accountable. She said that the whole point of what the Kestrel line had done above Kessler's Landing was to prove that humanity could win decisively without losing itself in the process, and that anything less would have made Kesler's crime and humanity's response the same act wearing 2 different uniforms. That distinction, more than the battle, more than Project Bastard, more than the 6-minute reply that gave this story its name, was the thing that ultimately reshaped how the wider galaxy understood humanity going forward. Because here is what changed in the months and years that followed Kessler's Landing. Every species that had quietly absorbed the Vashtar Dominion's 400-year doctrine of overwhelming force went back and reread it and found themselves forced to add an asterisk that had never existed before. Overwhelming force works, the asterisk read, except against a species that trains in silence for 80 years and only shows its hand once when it has no other choice. Diplomatic postures across a dozen neighboring civilizations shifted within the following year, not out of affection for humanity, but out of the same cold calculation that had doomed Grand Marshal Kesler personally. Nobody wanted to become the next case study. Trade agreements that had previously been offered to human envoys on unfavorable, condescending terms were quietly renegotiated. Border disputes that might once have been settled through simple intimidation were suddenly conducted with a strange, careful courtesy that human diplomats found almost amusing, in the way that watching a bully discover manners is always a little amusing. Admiral Voss did not enjoy the attention that followed. Those who served under him during the years after Kessler's Landing described a man who grew quieter, not more triumphant, in the aftermath of the engagement that made him famous across a dozen star systems. When asked, during a rare public address marking the first anniversary of the battle, what he wanted people to remember about that day, he did not talk about the tactics or Project Bastard or the elegant brutality of the encirclement maneuver that trapped Solon's task force. He talked about Administrator Selen, Okafor. He said that the last thing she did with her life was make sure 142 names were spoken out loud before the silence took them, and that everything the Kestrel line did afterward, every calculation, every drill, every year of quiet preparation that came before it, existed only in service of making sure that kind of silence never went unanswered again. A memorial was built on the rebuilt site of Kessler's Landing 3 years after the attack, once the soil had been cleared and the wheat fields, remarkably, had begun to grow again in the same patterns. Administrator Okafor had originally planted them in because the colonists who returned to rebuild insisted on it. Insisted that the fields look exactly as they had before as a way of proving that erasure had failed. The memorial itself was simple, a long, low wall of dark stone bearing 141 names beneath the name of the woman who had spoken them into the void, engraved in the order she had recited them, preserved from the recovered transmission. Visitors to Kessler's Landing, human and otherwise, in the decades that followed, often noted that the wall carried no image of the attack, no depiction of the Vashtar task force, no monument to Admiral Voss or the Kestrel line's victory. It was simply names. In the order a dying woman chose to say them. Dr. Amara Chen asked years later by a historian compiling the definitive account of the engagement why Project Bastard's name had never been formally revised even after the war's end, gave an answer that ended up printed on the opening page of that history. She said that the galaxy had spent 400 years assuming humanity was something small, something new, something that had not yet learned what it meant to bury its dead, and keep building anyway. She said the name stayed because it was never meant for the Dominion, and it was never really meant as a joke either. It was meant as a promise that the next time anyone mistook human patience for human weakness, the reply would already be built, already trained, already waiting, 340 light-years away, and closing. The Vashtar Dominion, in the decades following the tribunal, underwent a slow, uneven, and by most historical accounts incomplete transformation in how it approached the wider galaxy. It did not collapse. It did not vanish from galactic politics, but it never again attempted a demonstration strike against a human colony, and it never again treated a human silence as an invitation. Kelvish Orn, the tactical officer whose open-channel recording became one of the defining pieces of evidence in the historical record, gave a single interview many years later, long after his retirement from Dominion military service, to a joint human and Vashtar historical archive project studying the conflict from both sides. He was asked what he remembered most clearly from those 6 minutes above Kessler's Landing, more than the tactics, more than the losses, more than the death of Commander Solon. He said it was the silence right before the human fleet opened fire. He said it did not sound like an attack beginning. It sounded to him like a debt finally being paid, and he said that in 400 years of Dominion military history he had never once heard silence sound like that before. And he hoped, for the sake of every species still learning where humanity's edges were, that he never would again. That is the story of Kessler's Landing, and of the 6 minutes that followed it, and of a species that the galaxy had spent 80 years quietly, dangerously, catastrophically underestimating. It is a story about a farming colony that nobody thought worth defending, and a fleet that had spent 80 years training for a day it hoped would never come. It is a story about a message that was meant to travel across the galaxy and arrive as fear, and, instead, arrived as evidence in a war crimes tribunal. It is a story, in the end, about the particular danger of assuming that a quiet species is a weak one, and about what happens when a species forged in hardship finally decides that the waiting is over. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are plenty more waiting in the archive of humanity's long, quiet history among the stars. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. We've got new stories going up every single week. Let me know in the comments what your favorite moment was. Whether it was Dr. Chen naming her weapons system out of pure spite, or Admiral Voss's reply to that surrender request, or the memorial wall that carries nothing but names. I read every single comment, and I want to know what landed for you. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars.